Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Party. A few weeks ago we learned a design called Pinstripes, but here's the cool thing. You can take any design that you stitch from edge to edge and double it and create a grid. This makes such a cool texture for your quilts. I think it looks amazingly elegant. So let's jump on the machine and I'll give you some tips for stitching pinstripe grid lines. So I'm about halfway through quilting pinstripe grid lines, and the reason why I start here is because I want you to see how I've begun the design and filled it through the middle of my quilt. So I'm going to be breaking thread with every single line of quilting. It's just sometimes easier to do that, and I've stitched off into the batting, and that allows me to actually break thread completely. So what I did here, how I got started, was I got started in the center of my quilting space, then I spaced out a 1-inch line, then a 1/4-inch line, then a 1-inch line, then a 1/4-inch line, all the way down till I reached the outer edge. Then I worked my way around and down and began pulling up thread and quilting that same spacing of lines in the opposite direction. Actually, it's going through this way. And so I started quilting across, and so it's created this beautiful grid effect. It's almost a basket weave, and I think it's such an elegant texture. Now I'm using a combination of things to help me space my lines. I'm using a guide on my walking foot to space the wider space lines 1 inch apart, and then I'm using 1/4-inch masking tape, this blue painter's tape, to space the 1/4-inch lines. And I have trouble finding 1/4-inch painter's tape in my area. I live in a pretty small town, so I have to order it on Amazon, and I'll provide a link to that so you can find it too. If you live in a bigger city, I'm sure you can probably find it at your local hardware store. Even Walmart might carry it. So for the wider space lines, I've got my guide here on the machine. This is just a bar that attaches to my walking foot. I'm lining that up with that previously stitched line. And I should say, to get started with the design, the easiest way to do that is just either put a piece of tape on the quilt or draw a straight line right across the area where you want the design to begin. And that's the best way to get started. And then from there, all you have to do is use the guides or use some tape in order to space all the rest of the lines of quilting. Now, when I stitch off into the batting area, this might be confusing. I'm pretty much always tie off and bury thread tails. Like I tie them in a knot and bury them. And I'll provide another video link so that way you can go and see how I do that normally. But whenever I have an opportunity to stitch off and into the batting area, I will do that because I don't have to tie off and bury that thread tail. I can just simply clip those thread tails short. And I will secure those edges whenever I go and bind these blocks together, whether I just bind it or I actually connect these blocks together to create the marvelous mosaic quilt. So now I've lifted up on my tape and I'm repositioning it. I find that I can usually use the tape 2 or 3 times at least before it runs out of sticky. And then I'll have to just grab another piece. But I like to use tape over and over again so that way I'm not using up the whole roll just in one quilt. You know, I really want to be economical with it. And all I do when I'm working with the tape as a guide is I pull up my thread tails. I always pull up my thread tails to the surface. It's a really important step. You just rotate your hand wheel to bring that up to the surface. And then where the needle is sinking down, I'm going to lift the foot. Maybe you can see it a little bit. No, it's really hard to see. Basically, I am having the needle drop down right on the edge of the tape so that it's right next to the edge of the tape. I try not to stitch onto the tape. It's not a big deal if you do. If you accidentally stitch onto the tape, just kind of pick it out of your stitches. No big deal. But I can visually see this and see where the tape is and just run my needle right along the side of it. It's kind of like stitching in the ditch, but for me, I can see this really clearly. So I find it really easy just to stitch right on the edge of the tape. Now, if this is a struggle for you or you can't find thin masking tape like this, or you don't like the idea of putting tape on your quilt, you could just mark it. Just grab a marking pencil, grab a ruler, and just mark it on the surface of your quilt. That's an option too, and that's certainly open to you. If you space the lines wider apart, so let's say you had 1/4 inch or let's say 1/2 inch space lines, then you could go 1/2 of an inch apart, and then you could go with a wider spacing between the wider lines, like maybe 2 inches apart, and then you could use the edge of your walking foot and a guide on your walking foot, and that's all you would need. So here I'm back to spacing 1 inch apart, so I'm going 1 inch from this previously stitched line, and I just leave my tape in place while I'm stitching this one. There's no sense in pulling it up and moving it yet, not until I have this line stitched and I have basically a place for it to go. And so I'm lining up that guide bar, and because this is a straight line, I'm lining up the full length of that guide bar. This whole thing is lined up with that line of stitching. Now this means, of course, if that line starts to veer in one direction, if it starts to get stitched at an angle, or I do something weird on the line before, then that means that every line after it is going to be an echo. It's going to be based on that line of stitching, and it's going to be repeated. So if you want this to be absolutely 100% dead on, accurately perfect, the only way to do that is to mark every single line of stitching, quite honestly. So, you know, you kind of have to just be willing to accept a little bit of wiggle wobble and accept that that is normal and that happens. So I'm going to lift the tape again, and let's talk about pinstripes as a grid design, because this can sometimes change how a design works. And of course, some of the issues that you might see on your quilt. Pinstripes is just the nice even spacing of straight line quilting, you know, but whenever you're quilting it over and running perpendicular to other lines, like our pinstripes running in the other direction, well, that's when things can kind of go a little tricky. So if you start to see shifting of your fabric or pleats, there is pretty much, it's a common issue if you are maybe stitching at an angle to the grain line of your fabric. So you've got threads that run this way and threads that run this way. Well, let's say you wanted to put pinstripes and run it on the diagonal. Well, you're automatically going to be shifting fabric in a slightly weird way. So watch out for that. You know, pay attention to the placement of your quilting design, and if you are going to be putting the design at a weird angle to the grain line of the fabric, understand that that might have consequences. It might do something weird, you know. Another thing that you want to watch out for is just the fabric moving in general. And so one thing I did before I got started was I starched and pressed this fabric 2 times so it was nice and stiff. And that stiffness stops it from moving. You know, it stops it from shifting and starting to form what I call as a snow pile. It's a basically a big bubble of fabric and stuff that would be forming before the foot. And I don't get that because I take the time to starch and press my fabric and make sure it's stiff, it's flat, it's not going to be causing any issues on the surface of my quilt. And you would start to see it, especially in a grid style design. You would start to see it coming up to a perpendicular line, like that, coming up to this line. This line's running in the opposite direction. I've just messed up my tape, so I need to get that back in place. But it would be forming, I would start to see some like excess fabric forming before that line of stitching. And what happens when it's, you know, just too much fabric, you can't shift it, like maybe you can try and put a little bit of pressure on your hands, maybe spread it out, smooth it out, see if that will work. But if it's too much fabric, that's when it will kind of hit that basically wall of stitching and form a pleat. So the number one thing, whenever you're stitching any sort of grid design, whether it's grid lines, matrix, pinstripe grid lines, any of these designs, you want to just be conscious of what's going on with your fabric and constantly paying attention to it, looking at it, looking out for these issues, and going ahead and save yourself a whole bunch of time and headaches by starching and pressing your quilt before you start quilting. That's going to make such a big difference, and it really is going to result in a much easier and quicker quilting experience. So that's what I'm going to continue doing. I'm just going to be stitching these straight lines basically from the middle to the outer edges, and I'm spacing, keeping with this spacing, 1 inch apart, then 1/4 inch apart, all the way down the line. Then I'll return to the center and begin quilting those lines running in the opposite direction until the entire thing is covered in this beautiful grid design. And here's what it looks like whenever you finish pinstripe grid lines. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot quilting pinstripe grid lines with me, and you're ready to give it a try in a small quilt sandwich. Now we're quilting out small sandwiches like this so we can get to know all of the designs that I've included in my book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day. So there's 30 designs in the book, and really it does make it a lot easier to stitch them out in something small. But don't worry, you can always put them together to create a quilt like the one behind me. This is a technique called quilt as you go, and it keeps the project small and manageable, so that way you can put it together at the end, and it's just a lot easier to quilt, especially with walking foot style quilting. Now, if you'd like to join in the fun and make the quilt behind me, all you need is a copy of this book. So come and check it out at leahday.com/walkingfoot. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt!